Welcome. We're going to be in Genesis chapters 10 to 11 today. Real quickly, we're going to summarize what we covered before. Chapter 1, you had the 6 days of creation. Chapter 2, you had the 7th day of rest, as well as the specific creation of man and woman. On day 6, getting a little more specific there with all the details going on. Chapter 3, you had the fall of man. Chapter 4, you had Cain and Abel. And then in chapter 5, you had a long genealogy. Chapter 6, we got into the corruption of mankind. And okay, now that all these people have appeared, things are getting kind of bad. They're falling into wickedness. The sons of God were having relations with the daughters of men. And we looked at some of the options of what that could mean. Perhaps we're talking about angelic or demonic beings as the sons of God. Perhaps we're just talking about the descendants of Seth as the sons of God. Either way, wickedness is multiplying, and God has decided to cause a massive flood to wipe them out. But Noah received favor in the eyes of the Lord, and so God gave Noah a special charge to start building the ark. Chapter 7 is when the ark has been finished and Noah and his family, as well as the various animals, are entering the ark, and the flood begins. And chapter 8, the flood is subsiding. Chapter 9, we have the first major mention of a covenant, at least explicitly in Scripture. Sometimes people consider, the covenant with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, to not eat from that as a covenant. I mean, that's a possibility. The word is not explicitly mentioned there, but some people call that the Adamic covenant. And now here we have the Noahic covenant related to Noah, covenant of the rainbow, and God's promise not to wipe out the population of the earth in the same manner as he did before in that flood. Chapter 10, we have another genealogy. So we got the descendants of Noah. And then chapter 11, the first part of chapter 11, which we'll be reading, has the Tower of Babel account. And then the last part of chapter 11, which starts at verse 10 all the way to the end, we have another genealogy. So a lot of fun. If you want to be called on to read, please go to the Bible Study React channel. I only need like 3 people. So just go to that channel and then react to the message there. And then I'll have a list of people who I can call on to read. And I see Dogman has reacted first there. So, any questions on the summary? Quick questions so that we can get into reading chapters 10 and 11. Alright, I will assume no questions unless someone's typing one. That's fine. So as before, when we were reading through Genesis chapter 5, which had a long genealogy, that was just the whole chapter, I want you to look for 3 specific things as we read through this genealogy. So number 1, I want you to look for patterns in the genealogy and kind of note all of those different patterns, and that's the first thing I want you to look for. Any patterns. You might want to write them down on a notebook so you don't forget, or just in the chat box. And number 2, I want you to be looking for any breaks in those patterns. So we saw in Genesis chapter 5, everyone was dying, right? So-and-so lived a few hundred years and then he died, and so-and-so lived a number of years and then he died, except Enoch, who was taken up to be with the Lord. So the exceptions can be very important as those breaks in the pattern. So that's number 2. And number 3, I want you to look for any familiar names or places that you kind of recognize, that you might have read later on. Maybe when you're reading Exodus, or perhaps 1st and 2nd Kings, you might recognize some of those locations or names being mentioned. So, number 1, I want you to look for patterns as we read. Number 2, I want you to look for exceptions in those patterns. And number 3, I want you to look for familiar names and places. And also, I'm going to ask you guys to outline this chapter too. So as we're reading through, I want you to start thinking of how you would outline this chapter. So anything significant that you can kind of put in a big section, then maybe what's the next section, and things like that. So those 4 things I want you to do. Look for patterns, look for exceptions to those patterns, look for familiar names, places, and to start thinking of how you would outline this chapter. All right, Dogman, could you please read all of chapter 10?
Sure. I'm going to read from the ESV. All right. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons that were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, Dodanim. From these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language by their clans and their nations. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Habta, Raamah, and Sabteka. The sons of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, that is, the great city. Egypt fathered Ludim, Ananim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, and the Sinaites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward, the clans of the Canaanites dispersed, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. To Shem also, the father of all children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almodad, Shelef, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hodarim, Uzal, Dikla, Gobal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesha and the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood.
All right, thanks. Not an easy chapter to read, but you got it. All right, so for the things that I wanted you guys to look for, let's start with that, and then we'll get into the outline later. So any patterns that you guys saw? Oh, welcome, Snorlax. We're reading through Genesis chapter 10 right now, and we're looking for patterns. So yeah, lots of names. That's a good start, yeah. Any other patterns?
It goes from like father to son, and then an important son kind of from that gets chosen, and then it kind of goes through all those. It kind of continues on and on and on.
Yeah.
With some exceptions being of like notable people in history that people of the time like would know of through word of mouth.
Could you give an example of one of the exceptions to that pattern?
Nimrod.
Perfect, yeah, definitely.
A mighty hunter before the Lord, where it describes some of his accolades and stuff, and what he might be known as outside of this.
Yeah. So after we've established the pattern, so Matthew just says lots of names, That's correct. Yeah, lots of names. And Dogman brings up, okay, there seems to be, a specific format to how some of these names are laid out. And then we see a break in that pattern where we get much more than simple names when we get to Nimrod. So while we're thinking about Nimrod, why do you guys think that more detail is given about Nimrod? Is there some significance to this exception in the pattern?
Mark, is there a similarity between Nimrod and someone like Laban from the last genealogy, where Laban was markedly more wicked than everyone else? Is that a connection between the two? Is that a reason why he's set aside?
Do you mean Lamech?
Yeah, sorry, from
Yeah.
not Laban. My bad.
I mean, yeah, that's certainly a big possibility. Our commentary, the CBC Cornerstone Biblical Commentary series, does believe that Nimrod is described here as more of a despot, kind of an authoritarian, evil, wicked ruler, in that, the words to describe him mean that. And it also notes that the word for hunter there is an odd word to be used for a person, and it doesn't say the object of it, but this particular word for hunter doesn't necessarily have to apply to animals only. It could also easily, and has, applied to people as well. So yeah, it could be that he's wicked, and that's why he's mentioned explicitly here. So yeah, Enlil brings up Babel, and you could pretty much translate that as Babylon as well. The Book of Kings uses the same word and also translates it as Babylon, and you could pretty much think of them as interchangeable. Here the particular Hebrew word is Babel because they're using a wordplay, basically. They're using a wordplay to relate to the other Hebrew word that means confuse. So yeah, perhaps he's given more detail here because he's related to the very next chapter.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. So Hat brings up a commentary snippet from the Study Bible. So yeah, any other reasons why Nimrod is given more space here in these details?
I have a suspicion. Not like a so like therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Like, why? That's not a common phrase. Is that maybe that sounds like it's like a common phrase at the time that this was written? Like, right? So like, it might be also like, this was written by Moses, and it might have been a phrase then that they used. I guess it was like, common to them, and they're like, what's? Oh, this is the origin of that phrase. That's interesting. I don't know. Maybe this is my speculation.
Yeah, that's a possibility. So kind of giving the origin of, a phrase, kind of an idiom that they might be saying. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Oh yeah, that guy, he's like Nimrod. Yeah, my brother over there out in the woods, he's like Nimrod. Maybe, yeah. Was he the first king? It's certainly a possibility. Especially how you define king. If you use the broad sense of the term king, then yeah. He was definitely a king. I don't know if he was the first king, though. Maybe that title would belong to Cain, perhaps, in the city that he built. So yeah, I'll direct you guys to look at the locations now. So the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah. Nineveh, Calah, that is the great city. So, is there any significance to these locations being mentioned? This kind of ties in with number 3, to be looking for familiar names and places.
I actually have more of a question.
Okay.
I know it's your question, but I'm answering your question with a question. Would Moses have known at that time, or would God have given him the foresight as he wrote the first Pentateuch, that Nineveh and Babylon would be God's enemies,
That's certainly a
or
possibility.
he must have already known at that time.
Yeah. What do you guys think?
I think that these are locations that have some relevance of kind of placing and giving an understanding to the context of these people and how they kind of spread out. Not only is it locations that we recognize from later in scripture, it's also kind of charting out the progress of man in a way as it proceeded from Noah and the flood.
Yeah, that's definitely a big reason for these geographical locations in general to be listed. So yeah, Skog's question is a tough one. I'm not entirely sure on the specifics there of how much Moses knew about these particular cities, because this was long before the time period of when Assyria, for instance, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and this is long before Babylon came down and swept through the southern kingdom of Israel. So I don't know how much Moses would have known, but we could probably surmise that they were still doing wicked things in Moses's time. So I'll just mention this real quick, just reading from the commentary. Nimrod was the founder of several powerful cities of the east, and those cities became major enemies of Israel. So Nimrod became a symbol of the powerful empires that would eventually destroy Israel and punish Judah. Now, we don't know how much Moses knew would happen eventually, but perhaps that's one of the reasons why Nimrod in particular is given more details than all these other people mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Any other patterns that you guys see? All right, I'll just mention one more pattern then, is that we see nested genealogies. So not just these are the sons of one person. Sometimes we see nested genealogies where we see these are the sons of person A, and these are the sons of, let's say person B is one of the sons of person A. And then sometimes we get, now these are the sons of person B. And then it kind of gets more specific and kind of nested down that genealogical line. But that doesn't happen for every person mentioned. Only specific people get their sons mentioned as well. And just to review, we see a lot of names as well as some breaks in that pattern. We see some exceptions like Nimrod, for instance, and we also see geographical locations being mentioned as well, perhaps to illustrate the command that God had given them to scatter, spread abroad, and to multiply. One other pattern that I see in this genealogy is that we don't see people dying. Obviously they did die, right? But it's not mentioned explicitly, as opposed to Genesis chapter 5. So if you do look at Genesis chapter 5, so all the days of Adam, 930 years, and he died. All the days of Seth, and he died. All the days of Enosh, then he died. But you don't see that pattern in Genesis chapter 10. You just see the names and their sons, but not that they died or anything like that. So in a sense, it's a little more positive than Genesis chapter 5, which was just coming after the curse and coming after Cain had murdered his brother. This person died. And Genesis chapter 10, it doesn't have that negative kind of note to it. All right, so we saw some patterns, we saw some exceptions, we saw some familiar names, such as Babylon, which is translated here as Babel, but we saw Babylon, we saw Assyria, and we saw Nineveh. Lots of familiar names going around. Perhaps you might have noticed, Havilah, especially if you've been reading like 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, you might recognize that name. You've probably recognized Sodom and Gomorrah and some other places. So let's go ahead and outline this chapter then. So I want you guys to outline this chapter, all of you, in the chat, and you can just go ahead and type it out and maybe have a short little heading or title, and then this is the verse reference. So for instance, verses 1 to 5, and then you give a little title there. Don't do that, because that's breaking the outline. That's not a good outline. But just go ahead and do that and outline it, and then maybe 6 to 10, here's another title. Just go with whatever looks like a natural break and kind of title that. So go ahead and outline it. I'll give you guys maybe like 4 minutes or so, and that timer starts now. So welcome Ed J and anyone else who's just joined. We're currently reading Genesis chapter 10, and right now we just have some quiet time for a few minutes so that we can outline Genesis chapter 10. So you can start working on that, or at least just read Genesis chapter 10. I think it would also be great if you posted it all publicly, so that's why I suggested just write it down in the text chat and then you can send it. So welcome Sola Gratia. We're currently reading Genesis chapter 10 and we're outlining it. So I gave everyone a few minutes to start outlining Genesis chapter 10, and you can at least read through Genesis 10. And then if you have some time at the end, you can start outlining it. Oh no, don't cheat. Don't look at the article. Oh, hey Avi. We're currently reading Genesis chapter 10 right now, and we're outlining it. So I've given everyone a few minutes. I think I'll extend that time period. Give you a few more minutes to outline Genesis chapter 10. Yep, so maybe some of you have already spotted a great way to outline the passage, and to give you guys a hint, I'll just say Japheth, Ham, Shem. That's the hint to help you outline. Japheth, Ham, Shem. And I think someone new has joined, maybe? Hi Roro. We're reading Genesis chapter 10 right now, and right now we're outlining it. Oh, sorry about that. I don't get the notifications when someone joins. But yeah, it is a genealogy of the development of the nations from Noah's sons. It's also sometimes called the Table of Nations, this whole chapter. Oh no! Oh, that's rough, dog man. Alright, well, we do have to move on. I wish we could just stay here until I see every individual person's outline. But I saw Skogs's first, and I know a bunch of you are already still writing it out. So I'll just give you guys my outline real quick. This isn't perfect, but it's pretty straightforward. Verse 1 gives you the introduction. Verses 2 to 5, Japheth's descendants. Verses 6 to 20, Ham's descendants. And verses 21 to 31, you have Shem's descendants. And then you have the outro in verse 32, which kind of mirrors verse 1. So I think it's a pretty straightforward outline there. Japheth, Ham, and then Shem. And while looking at this outline, I'm going to ask you guys a question. Why is Ham's section longer than the other sections? Japheth has a really tiny section, and it's just a few verses. Shem's section, it's a little longer, but Ham gets the longest section here. Why do you guys think that is? Or maybe there's no reason, it's just the way it is.
It's contextual. It has all the nations that kind of surround Israel kind of in that bunch.
Yeah, exactly. These are the nations, especially from Ham's line, that would be in the land of Canaan. And if we go all the way back to our first Bible study when we were talking about why Genesis was written in the time of Moses, it was written, as one of the reasons at least, it was written to encourage the Israelites to go into the promised land and to forget all about Egypt, but to go into the promised land and to encourage them to do that. And so it looks here like Moses is giving them the pertinent details that they would need to know, kind of about the background of the area that they are going to be traveling to after the wilderness period and things like that. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it right there. And one last thing I will bring up just to kind of solidify all of this. Let me see if I can get this whole thing. So I'm going to bring up a little image that contains a handy dandy map for all of you guys. So it's loading right now. But after it loads, I want you to open up the map. You'll probably have to, open up the original just to get it bigger on your screen. So there's the map. So this is the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, divided into those three major sections, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. So you can see Ham, it's the green part, down in the bottom left kind of corner. You see Japheth up in the top right area, and you see Shem kind of in the middle area there. And talking about what we looked at before on why Ham's section is a lot longer than the other sections, you can look at the little box in the left, kind of the bottom left area, and it says that this entire inset area, which is a zoom into kind of the land of Canaan, if you see the red box right in the middle, it's kind of zooming in on that. This entire area is dominated by the descendants of Ham. So you have all of these peoples and nations listed there, part of the land of Canaan, which would be very pertinent and important for the Israelite people to whom Moses is writing Genesis to. So hopefully that kind of lays it all out. Since we are given geographical locations, we can plot them broadly on a map or an atlas or something like that. And this chart comes from the CSB Study Bible, if you're interested in where that comes from. All right, any questions on Genesis chapter 10 before we move on? Nice. It's a great map. I looked through larger atlases to find the Table of Nations map, but I couldn't find it, so I just used the Study Bible one. So yeah, super handy. All right, let's get to the chapter 11, next section. Skoggs, could you please read chapter 11, verses 1 to 9?
Certainly. Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops to the heavens." I skipped a little bit, I'm sorry. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing what they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
All right, so that was Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Thank you for reading that. And my first question is, I'm going to kind of phrase this aggressively, actually. So, looking at verse 1, chapter 11, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. But hold on a second, says the skeptic. I thought that we were looking at different languages in chapter 10. Now we're saying that the whole earth had one language. So if you look at Genesis chapter 10, verse 5, everyone according to his language, to their families, according to their nations. And these are the sons of Ham, verse 20, according to their families, according to their languages, plural. And you see languages, plural, mentioned again in verse 31. So there seems to be a contradiction here, right? Talking about multiple languages in chapter 10, and now we're talking about magically everything's one language now when we get to the next chapter. Is there a contradiction here? What do you guys think?
Is this kind of like in the creation account? Chapter 2 lays out sort of the outline of creation, and then the third chapter returns to another point in creation before he makes Adam. I kind of got to that point too, and I was like, wait, hold on. Is this the same thing in this text where the genealogy sets forth like an outline of what is happening, and then chapter 11 goes back to a period in the past?
Yeah, I think you got it exactly right there. So you got to remember, Genesis is not laid out in strict chronological order. Sometimes, just like Skaggs has said, you'll get a kind of broad outline, and then you get a little more specific in there. For instance, if you look just at the next section of chapter 11, you have the descendants of Shem. Again, after mentioning the descendants of Shem back in chapter 10. So yeah, we're zooming in on a specific point that occurred during the time of chapter 10, sometime during that particular time. And you could consider the various languages, the various nations being scattered abroad in chapter 10 as the result of chapter 11, the incident at Babel. Perhaps added as an afterword, just kind of getting a little more specific. Here's more detail on this one event. So yeah, good stuff. All right. Any questions that you guys had on chapter 11, verses 1 to 9?
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do we know about the tower? And anything specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we know how they built it. They built it out of bricks that were burnt thoroughly. We also can have some idea of what it might have looked like through archaeology and things like that. So if we go ahead and look at a little representation of it. This is from Merrill Unger's reconstruction of the Tower of Babel based on different archaeological findings of similar kind of towers built at that time. This is probably what it would have looked like, and it would be called a ziggurat because it's got this big stair-step pattern going on there. So it's not just like a round Tower of Pisa or something like that shooting up into the sky. It was more likely built like this because that is what we see from archaeology most often. So for Enley's question, any idea what that one language was? I have no idea. I have no idea what that one language would be. And for Matt, what did they mean by heaven? Like how tall were they aiming for? That's another great question because the word heaven could simply mean sky. Could also mean outer space, could also be referring to the realm of God as kind of a separate area. Yeah, American English. So yeah, really good questions there. And I just want to bring out one more little thing, just because we've been equating Babel with Babylon, and I kind of want to give you more support for that. So this is from the Baker Encyclopedia, Babel. Translation of a Hebrew word in Genesis 10:10 and 11:9. Elsewhere, it's translated Babylonia or Babylon in 2 Kings. The rendering Babel in the Genesis passages is intended to relate the name to the early cultural setting reflected by Genesis 11, especially to the attempt to build a tower. The translation Babel is also intended to associate the Tower of Babel incident with the popular understanding that Babel is derived from a root meaning of the Hebrew to confuse. So it's kind of a wordplay there as well. So hopefully that gives you...
I find it amusing.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh yeah, it is
I do find it
amazing.
amusing that there is a wordplay in Hebrew, as well as in English here of babble and babbling and confusion.
Yeah, it is interesting that way. You just spell Babel differently in English, B-A-B-B-L-E, but kind of fun. Well, they weren't trying to build Babylon itself. They're just trying to build a big tower in Babylon. Kind of in the region of Shinar, the land of Shinar. Alright, we'll get moving on, and still in this section though. So, Trinity asks, what about verse 6? Behold, they are one people, they all have the same language, and this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. I would say that we're just talking about unity there. They're very strongly unified. They have a plan. They can communicate with each other. They have one single goal, which is to reach the heavens, so to speak. I don't know if there's much more we can say about that. Yeah, that's another great question, Trinity. So why was it bad for them to be building this tower?
Because well, he gave the command to go and fill the earth, but they were like, no, we're gonna stay together and build a tower. So he went and scattered them.
Yeah, so they were disobeying God's command to scatter abroad. That's one reason. I think there's another reason though. What do you guys think? Any other reasons? Oh yeah, Maddie already mentioned it. Making a name for themselves, reaching the heavens. That is extremely prideful, and I think that is the other reason why this is a bad thing to be doing. Making their own ways to reach heaven, perhaps they were challenging God. Yeah. Either way, we do know that they were doing bad things, because they were punished for what they were doing. So one last thing I want to note in this section is that we actually have a chiasm here. I know some of you are having flashbacks now back to Proverbs, our Proverbs study when we're looking at a lot of chiasms. But there's actually a chiasm in verses 4 to 9. And a chiasm is where you have kind of a stair-step pattern, very ironically, like a ziggurat kind of pattern, where you have the first and last verse or section, and that is all on the same topic. And then you have the second verse and the second to last verse kind of on the same topic as well. So I don't have an outline for this, but if we just go ahead and test this theory out, it should line up. So the first verse of the chiasm is verse 4, the last verse is verse 9. So verse 4, come let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth. Then we look at verse 9, therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And here's the connection. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. And there's a contrast there. So verse 4, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. Verse 9, here's the connection. Then the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. So that's not enough for a chiasm though. We have to continue on to the second verse compared with the second to last verse. So Genesis 11:5, that's the second verse, and verse 8 is the second to last verse. Let's compare these. Verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Verse 8, so the Lord dispersed from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. So, building in verse 8, verse 5, we also see building or built there as well. And also talking about, the city and the tower. Verse 8 also mentions the city as well. So one more thing, we will look at verses 6 and verse 7. Now, these are the two middle verses of the chiasm. And when you're looking at the peak, you could say, of the pyramid, or the ziggurat, the peak, the middle verses, these are usually the ones that have the most emphasis on them. So verse 6, the Lord said, behold, they are one people, they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. So that's strength in unity in verse 6. And then in verse 7, come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So you see contrast there, and you also see emphasis. No matter how strong man is, no matter how unified they are, that nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them, God still overrides that very easily with his strength, with his wisdom, and his might. Let's confuse their language. Problem solved. Now they can't, do what they were trying to do before. God still overrides and can override all of that, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how unified they are. God is still sovereign and in control. So Skoggs asks an interesting question there. Do you think this was Christ coming down, dispersing them, things like that? It's a great question. We do kind of get the idea and sense that when there has to be some kind of physical manifestation or incarnation or pre-incarnation, that's kind of the role that Christ takes. But we see in verse 7 that plural personal pronoun, come let us go down, and there confuse their language. So we looked at what that could be back in our first chapter of study, those personal plural first person pronouns that God uses of himself. And we basically concluded that we're talking about a plurality of persons there. Maybe not the full sense of the Trinity that we get from the New Testament, but at least some kind of plurality of persons. So I would say that, the full Godhead is involved here, all three persons. But, it could be Christ doing the primary act of, all this and going down. It's possible, but I think it's best to keep it in the plurality of persons here. So any questions? Do you guys at least see the chiasm there? All right, that's good. Hopefully I explained that well enough. Especially our Proverbs people. Looking at all those chiasms in Proverbs, it'll be very familiar to them. I think this might have been one that was on our Proverbs quiz at one time when we were looking at the different literary structures. It's all right, Hat. I don't think we'll have a quiz on Genesis, don't worry. We'll just be outlining more stuff so you guys have practice with that. Alright, let's move on to the last section of chapter 11, and this will go by pretty quickly, so we're almost done. So chat, could you please read verses 10 to 32? Just finish off chapter 11.
Certainly. These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Parkshad 2 years after the flood, and Shem lived after he fathered Parkshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Parkshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah, and Parkshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he had fathered Eber 403 years, and he had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. And Peleg lived after he fathered Reu 209 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug, and Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor, and Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah, and Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abraham and Nahor took wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. And the daughter of Haran the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren; she had no child. Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. They went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
All right, thank you. So that was the last section of chapter 11. We go through Shem's genealogy once more. We already did that in chapter 10. Why do you guys think that we have Shem's genealogy again in chapter 11? Yeah, take care, Skogs. Shem's best genealogy. To connect to Abraham's story, yes, Abraham is extremely important. It's most definitely worth mentioning Shem's genealogy again. And you also know that this genealogy goes further than the one in chapter 10. We get a lot more names mentioned now in Shem's genealogy to get all the way down to Abraham. So as before, when we're reading genealogies, you look for three things. Number one, you look for patterns. Number two, you look for exceptions in the pattern. And number three, you look for familiar names and locations. So number one, what pattern do you guys see in this genealogy? Or patterns? Doesn't seem to list all the names of all the kids, but only the ones leading to Abram. Yeah. So we also see years lived are mentioned each time now. That's a very good observation, Ligi. And yeah, Roro, specific child, trying to get to the shortest distance to Abram. And then the years after as well. So what's the significance here about mentioning these years? Do you guys see any reason why the author would mention these years? Perhaps any pattern in these years? The number of years?
The lifespans are shortening.
Yes, exactly. So the lifespans are shortening. Lifespans decreasing, as Dogman says. They're getting weaker now. But yeah, that's a great observation. This goes back to, I think, Genesis chapter 6 in our study back then, where God says that his spirit wouldn't persist with mankind any longer, and that their years would be numbered to 120 years. And we looked at two main options as to what that could mean. Number one, it could be referring to the time until the flood. So 120 years, okay, now the flood will happen. That's how their days will be numbered. The other option is that we could be talking about average or general lifespan, maximum perhaps, general lifespan of people, minus a few exceptions of course, of people to be numbered to 120 years. And the greatest support for that interpretation is the Genesis 11 genealogy, where we do see those lifespans being shortened to the point where when we get to the last number mentioned, we see 120 years. Let me see if I can find that exact verse. Yeah, it's mentioned somewhere in Genesis chapter 11 where you have that person living to 120 years after being the father. Actually 119, that's the number. So verse 25, Nahor lived 119 years, just under 120 years after he became the father of Terah. Now you could still take the other interpretation of 120 years in that you're talking about a duration of time before the flood, when God said 120 years, because you'll notice that this isn't exactly 119 years lifespan for Nahor, because 119 years after he became the father of Terah. So he would have already have been some age. I don't know how old he was. We could say maybe 20, maybe 40, however old he was. So he did live longer than 120. Go ahead.
Isn't it mentioned that he was 29?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's right in the previous verse. So 29. Yeah, We could be a lot more exact than that. Still greater than 120, but we do see those lifespans decreasing. And that will, continue to be a theme later on in the later books of the Bible, as well as in our own modern lives. Yeah. There are some exceptions, of course. Some people are given grace by God to live past 120 years in the Bible, even a long time after their lifespans were decreasing. All right, any other patterns or exceptions that you guys see, or familiar names?
I'd like to kind of note that this, with the previous genealogy in Genesis, has a lot of parallels kind of with the ages and such. Thus, this kind of read in parallel. I don't know if you've talked about plausible, multiple authors of kind of the Pentateuch as a whole.
Yeah, we did
But it's
in
an
our very
interesting
first
thought.
study. But yeah, we talked about that a lot, our first study, and discerning authorship, and looking at the documentary hypothesis, and things like that, and source criticism. But we can't get into that detail today. All right, well, one exception I see, and this is kind of already mentioned before, but one exception is that we see more detail with Terah and his family as opposed to everyone else. All right, we kind of saw that, okay, you see one child and then that child's child trying to get to the straightest line to Abram, and then we see more detail for Abram and Terah's family all the way at the end. So you could say that there's a lot of emphasis here. Yeah, the other people are kind of important just because they were part of Abram's genealogy, but what we want to talk about now is Abram, and that's what we'll get into in chapter 12, and we'll also, well, next week at least. I don't want to bring up too much stuff, but next week we'll also bring up, some maps of where Abram was going and his family and his journeys and all of that good stuff. And that is what chapter 11 pretty much does. It introduces us to Abram, who is extremely important for the Israelite people, and thus extremely important for Moses to be writing about, because he's writing to the Israelite people. And I'm already assuming Mosaic authorship because we covered this in chapter 1, as opposed to multiple sources, multiple authors at least. You could still have multiple sources and Moses as the kind of editor for those things, but that was our chapter 1 study, and I don't want to get into more detail on that. But any final questions on Genesis chapters 10 to 11 before we close this out? Yeah, that's a great question, Roro. And if we look at chapter 12, we can kind of see an answer there. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, from your relatives," and so on and so forth. So yeah, there was a sense where God was directing Abram. So it looks like we see just a general picture of what happens in verse 31. They went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. Well, we don't see the reason why that happens, except when we get into chapter 12. All right, we'll go ahead and close it there. So Dogman, could you please pray for us as we head out?
Sure. God, thank you for the Bible. Thank you for your word. Thank you for this time that we spend together. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for the vast wisdom and knowledge that is just easily available in the Bible through your words that you've given us easily and freely. Help us to actually let that to apply what you want us to learn, so that we don't just have like a mental knowledge of it, but we also live it out. Help us to seek your will and to grow and in love for you, every the more and more every day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.